Thank you very much, Mohammed, for this really kind and nice invitation. And also thank you, the whole Princeton team of the University in Hong Kong to invite me for the possibility to present parts of my research here today. My presentation today is based on a multi-sided ethnography, which I have been conducting for almost 10 years, sometimes more intensive, sometimes less intensive, because I'm also have a teaching position in between, on the role of Pentecostal church communities or Congolese on the migration routes. I will try to unfold roughly in the next 40 minutes my research on religious infrastructure of Congolese migration diaspora and religious networks in 3 cities in the global south, in Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, and in Guangzhou. There were 3 of us. We just had crossed the border from Syria to Turkey. We climbed into the back of a truck and ducked behind the food boxes. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning when we suddenly stopped in the middle of the road. We heard noises, voices. I was afraid. It was the police. I prayed to God, please God, don't let them find us. They opened the truck and searched for something with a flashlight. They didn't find us. All of us felt relieved and we started to thank and praise God. This is the testimony which was offered by a parisher in front of a church community, thanking God for having helped him to cross the border during the Sunday service of a Congolese-based revival church in Istanbul, which I attended in 2011 in spring. It reveals 2 notable connections between religion and migration. First of all, the role of faith for the believer on the migration journey as a whole, and second, the specificity of spaces in which religion is practiced alongside the migration routes. These locations are, as I will argue, part of a broader religious infrastructure in which believers are sharing religious day-to-day life experiences, they keep up with their religious duties, and which serve as a reference point, all while being mobile or immobile for the believer. In my presentation today, I will delve into the interplay of religion, of global migration and urban spaces of Congolese migrants in 3 metropolis, as I said already before, Istanbul, Guangzhou, and Rio de Janeiro. Hence, I will describe how Congolese establish religious networks and how religious inspired aspirations can facilitate transnational migration and kind of a religious placemaking, better a religious infrastructure in this metropolis. In the recent years, there has been an increasing interest in urban and migration studies of the very diverse religious movements in the global south, global cities, whereby religion is not only envisioned as an accumulation of religious practice and structures, but also as more or less like a configuration in which the religious and the urban are intertwined, reciprocally productive and mutually transformative. With regard to Pentecostalism, researchers have observed also a close relation between Pentecostalism and entrepreneurial initiatives and aspirations for new opportunities through migration. Referring to Ananya Roy and Ivor Ong's idea of worlding as an analytical framework of post-colonial urbanism, I will analyze the linkages between transnational migration routes, urban structures, the social and economic self-organization, religious identity of migrants, as well as the religious worlding practices. Furthermore, in this presentation, I will draw on Abdulmalik Simon's and I will show how religious migrants create sophisticated, widely ramified networks, which could also be seen as a process of worlding from below, reaching out for a larger world through circuits of migration, resource evacuation, and commodity exchange. Maybe first a small introduction in what is Pentecostal religion in the Congo, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. For more than 3 decades, Pentecostalism has had a massive impact on the religious culture of the Democratic Republic of Congo, as it has in other countries in the sub-Saharan region. The religious landscape of the DRC has been radically modified under the term Église de réveil, in English, awakening churches, as most of these Pentecostal churches are called. This Christian awakening, which emerged at the end of the Mobutu era against the background of political instability, economic crisis, and escalating violence in the country, has affected more aspects than just only the religious sphere. Since the 1990s, the Congolese public sphere and culture has become increasingly charismatic. New forms of religious music, films, theater productions, as well as radio or TV stations with a charismatic habitus have developed. Furthermore, traditional models of kinship and moral agendas of solidarity have been redefined and restructured. For many decades, Congolese have emigrated towards other African countries, European and Northern America. Due to the escalating crisis in the Democratic Republic in Congo in the late 1980s, Congolese more frequently started to emigrate towards Europe and the United States and Canada, and of course also towards other African countries. At the same time, mobility and migration globally became a major concern, and especially when the hegemonic states of the global North established a new mobility regime with dramatically restricting their migration policies with far-reaching consequences for people from the global South. Among other reasons, and in response to these new restrictive policies, Congolese started to alter their migration strategies and follow new routes, either undertaking circuits, journeys that sometimes take more years, sometimes decades, and involve transiting several countries before reaching their desired destination, or they target new destinations. Countries like Turkey or Brazil, with relatively open visa possibilities, turned into new transit and immigration countries. In addition, countries like China have, due to their accessible business visa and trading opportunities, become new destinations for Congolese migrants and traders. In these cities, also in the cities Congolese are targeting, like Istanbul, Rio, and Guangzhou, sub-Saharan African revival parishes have arisen. During the last 20 years, Turkey has become an important immigration hub for migrants from Africa. Also, Congolese migrants have increasingly targeting Istanbul. Many seek asylum at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in the hope of getting resettled to a global North country after their recognition, while others try to journey on into Europe clandestinely. In addition, one can find Congolese students as well as suitcase traders who travel backwards and forwards between Istanbul and Kinshasa, Paris, Brussels, or Johannesburg. Due to this vast fluidity, the Congolese community in Istanbul remains small. Estimates from them besides 100 and 200 in the year 2015. Many transiting Congolese only want to stay a really short period in Istanbul. In the majority of cases, though, after they arrive there, things become very difficult. We have already run out of money, or prices for the transfer to Greece are too high. We need to wait for better season to cross the sea, or after applying for UNHCR, they have to wait for the decision and resettlement. This procedure often takes several years. Hence, we have to find ways to make living and to deal with these long waiting periods. Around 10 African churches have emerged in the center of Istanbul since 2000. Among them, there is the Congolese revival-based church Église Charité, Charity Church. Looking at the urban landscape, these churches are not really at the first sight visible because officially they are not registered. Many of them are subtenants in existing Protestant churches in Istanbul, in the center of Istanbul. Others convene in basement apartments, or like Église Charité did it for several years, they convene in hotel lounges every Sunday. As Congolese believers emphasized while waiting for journey on and living as an African Christian minority in a white Muslim-dominated country, being subject to arbitrary state power as well as racial discrimination in daily life, l'Église Charité constitute a place of refuge for them, a meeting point for the community, a space for regrouping. Churchgoer emphasized the different style of spirituality, the African way of celebrating, preaching in Lingala, which is one of the local languages in the DRC, and French, music and the dancing, which enabled them to experience the power of the divine. Out of the Sunday workshop, they draw the spiritual strength that support them in their daily life. So for Moana, one of my interview partners, who in fall 2015 traveled from Kinshasa to Istanbul at his first stop of his journey towards Europe. Although he knew next to nothing about Istanbul, he already had heard about the Congolese church on the Bosporus. Upon arrival there, friends introduced him into the church. Shortly after, he started to pray and to preach the gospel there. In spring 2016, Moana and some friends tried to continue their journey to Greece, but they failed and were deported back to Turkey. While being detained in a Turkish deportation center, they started to organize daily prayers among themselves. And the quotation from Moana to this is, especially during these times, kind of situations, you need to gather and to pray. Only with God's blessing can you hope to endure those extreme precarious situations in which you do not know what might happen to you. But eventually, with the help of God and the human rights law, we got released, and as soon as it was possible, we journeyed on again and left Turkey. Attending the church on a Sunday is regarded as a Christian duty. In Istanbul, the parishioners also take advantage of another aspect of the church. A few years ago, the head of the church, Pastor Alain, together with some of his parishioners, founded an informal business enterprise, organizing and intermediating for Congolese and other French-speaking traders who regularly come to Istanbul. They pick them up at the airport, they put them up in a hotel, they accompany them to the sellers, and they bargain and translate for them. Most of these traders coming to Istanbul buy clothes or electrical devices. Many of them are believers, and some are even pastors who preach on Sundays in the Istanbul-based Revival Church. Due to this constant going and coming of Congolese traders, as well as transiting and remaining church members, new transnational contexts are here established and furthered within the church, which has an effect on the local situation and on the parishes. For some of them, like Moana, they make their living out of intermediating for traders while they are residing in Istanbul. During my research, I was introduced to several Congolese traders and pastors from Vienna, Brussels, Kinshasa, but also from Johannesburg, Libreville, or Abidjan, who attended L'Église Charité during their stay. Some of the traders were not only traveling to Istanbul, but also made use of connection of business trips to Guangzhou or to Dubai. So also Nicole, a trader, which I met later in Guangzhou, who traveled back by a church fellow for the first trading trip to Istanbul, and during this trip attended also the church. Since then, she expanded her travels to Dubai and to Guangzhou. As I described above, in Istanbul, their social and religious exclusion, as well as precariousness, state arbitrariness, and racism determine a great part of Congolese believers' daily life. The church itself symbolizes an important place of refuge for the transiting and residing Congolese. The space itself is closely entangled with economic activities as well as a permanent fluidity, as trading and transiting Congolese are the majority. When we're going now to another spot, to Rio de Janeiro, to South America, since 2003, there has been a significant growth in the number of refugees applicants from the Democratic Republic of Congo in Brazil. As in Istanbul, the vast majority of these arriving Congolese plan to travel onwards towards North America or to Europe. Many have already transited via South Africa, Angola to reach Brazil. Congolese in Rio estimate their number about 400. A considerable number of them are refugees, undocumented migrants, or students. Although most of them have a middle-class background and many of them are graduates, the majority of them are struggling to make a living in Rio. Many of them live next or in Rio's favelas, which are irregular settlements at the suburban of Rio. And they consider the neighborhoods in which they are living as a war zone between drug dealers and the police. As many of them are aiming to journey on, they prefer to stay out of this kind of, although living in, to prefer they stay out of the politics and of the conflict in these neighborhoods. This has again an effect on how they organize the church. We are foreigners in this country, and many of us are in transit. When you arrive here, you go to the church in order to pray with your brothers and sisters. But we do not only pray together. Your brother might facilitate you a job and support you while searching for an apartment. In the parish, we find our compatriots and orientations. It's a place of home in a foreign environment. Elke Kine, the head of the music band of the Assemblea de Deus in Prastapinha, this is the Congolese revival parish there, told me this at our first encounter. At that time, after living several years in South Africa and in Angola, Elke Kine had just arrived in Rio. Other than in Istanbul, Rio's urban landscape is marked by thousands of Brazilian Pentecostal churches. Structures of urban violence, which for decades have dominated everyday life in the irregular settlements, have contributed to this tremendous Pentecostal growth in the metropolis. During my research in Rio, another dimension of the entanglement between religion and global aspiration became apparent here. 4 of the 7 members of the church band RDC Congo Elembo were hoping to become professional musicians, and the church offered them the opportunity to rehearse and to perform in public. Performing regularly in the church and cultural spaces, planning to record their first music album, they made use of Rio's significant evangelical music industry, which is existing already since the 1990s. Within this wide variety of Christian hip-hop, Christian rock, pop bands, they performed in French, in Lingala, in Swahili and Portuguese, using Congolese and Angolan dance styles as well as Brazilian samba rhythm, thereby seeking to achieve recognition not only in Rio's music scene, but also as African Christian musicians internationally. Their professional ambitions are not primarily associated with Rio specifically. The fact that the city offered them good opportunities to pursue musical careers did not constitute a reason to remain there. Most of these band members were preparing to journey on their journey, whether to Europe or to North America. African religion music has gained enormous popularity as a commercial genre on the global scale. In the transnational market of music, literature, or video circulating in global revival networks, performance do not rely solely on the success in a specific location. That means like if you gain somewhere success, you can also make it in another city, another place. A few years after our initial encounter, LK Kine journeyed on to Canada with his family. Though not becoming a famous Christian musician, he today sings in his own church, which he founded in Toronto, gathering Congolese and other African revival Christians there. Upon a closer look, what we can observe here is the interlacing between religion, diasporic network, transnational mobility, and the aim for success. In the church setting, marked by transiting parishes, the band makes music in order to praise God, first of all. At the same time, however, the musicians, following their aim to becoming professionals, make use of a vivid religious and secular music scene in Rio. Meanwhile, we are at the same time preparing for their next migration stage and hope to make use of the musical experience they gained during their time in Rio. The existence of this diasporic religious music market gives them the confidence that they can further pursue their professional career in the prospective destination. Shifting to Guangzhou, likewise as in Istanbul, since the beginning of the 2000s, the Chinese trading city of Guangzhou has become increasingly targeted by Congolese. This followed strengthening political and economic relations between the Democratic Republic of Congo and China, easing visa facilitation and travel agency organizing flights and baggage allowance, keeping logistics flow. However, other than in Istanbul, the primary target of the Congolese here is trading and not intending to journey on towards Europe or North America. In 2012, approximately 500,000 Africans were residing in China, with Guangzhou hosting the largest community. According to Congolese community leaders, there are about 450 Congolese who are were living permanently in Guangzhou in 2015 when I did my field research, while a much larger number of suitcase traders frequently traveled back and forth between Guangzhou and Kinshasa, but also between Guangzhou and Paris, London, Brussels, Luanda, or Melbourne. These traders in general stay 3 days to 3 months. A great number of them are women known as femmes commerçantes, commercial women. In addition, many of the residing Congolese are students, of which many again work as intermediators for Congolese and other sub-Saharan businessmen coming to Guangzhou. Others have opened up cargo agencies, with a few of them also seeking to pursue a professional career as soccer player. Predominantly located in or around the urban districts of Bay or Sanyuani, cargo agencies, restaurants, bars, hairdressers, as well as African churches have emerged in the area. Some of these churches have existed for more than a decade, with others established recently. All of them were not officially registered, but they were well known by and under the surveillance of Chinese authorities. Located at the 10th floor in a huge commercial building in Bay, l'Église Poisson, in English, the Church of Power, is one of the 8 Congolese churches which in 2015 existed in the neighborhood. While on the first floor, retailers are selling clothing, electric devices, and African drapery, on the 10th floor, the Sunday worship starts at 11 a.m. About 100 churchgoers were attending the worship. The church band, consisting of 6 women and 5 men in their 20s, was leading the Christian pop music throughout the sermon. A Congolese pastor and trader from Kinshasa, who frequently visits the church on his business trip, was preaching. If you are not in the dialogue with God and you are coming to Guangzhou and you do business, you will not be successful. You will buy the same t-shirts as all the others do, and you will return to Kinshasa and not able to sell them. This is even though you're praying, but you do not reach the right dialogue with God. Therefore, you do not really listen to his advice, and you are buying the wrong articles. Preaching on prosperity, economic and social success are common features of all Congolese revival churches around the globe. However, in Église Poissons, the content of the service is closely adapted to the churchgoer's reality, the daily business on the local markets. Pastors do not only preach the word of God, their service also instructs the believers on how to yield profit. In this context, the aspiration of moving on in an economic or a geographical sense fits to new social patterns, practices, and networks of this religious movement. For Pastor Jean, the head of the church, being a man of God and a businessman goes for him hand in hand. In 2005, he arrived in Guangzhou with a business visa, and a few years later, he founded his own church. During his frequent business trips to Brussels or Paris, he preaches the gospel in various churches over there. In turn, pastors often pay him a visit back to preach in Église Poissons in Guangzhou, as well as to buy commodities. As in Istanbul, the church serves as a connecting hub, facilitating the mobility. However, different from Istanbul, the church is almost exclusively filled with merchants or people who are kind of doing trade. Among them, many of them are doing petty trade between Guangzhou and Kinshasa, like Helena Okita. For the pastor of her church back in Kinshasa, she embarked for Guangzhou for the first time in 2012, and since then prolonged her visits from 1 week to several months, purchasing predominantly clothing at the very cheap wholesale at the outskirts of the city. She has, over the years, enlarged her business activities and became a broker for other Congolese traders. Attending the church on Sunday morning, which she interprets predominantly as a Christian duty is also a way for her to gather with other Congolese and to potentially meet new clients for them she can work again. So we also see here again the entanglement between ideas of economic success, migration, mobility, and religion. Just coming to the end for conclusion. What time is it? Still okay. So what I wanted to show here is that Congolese revival churches, they have expanded globally and contributed to a transformation of the physical and social landscape on the metropolis where they take root. In contrast to their Catholic or Protestant counterparts, revival churches are much easier to form without much formality, official permission, or trained leadership. This means that these new churches with new profiles can be easily founded on the different stages of migration and adjust in response to the settings in the host societies. In addition, due to its high level of abstraction, new charismatic religion is adjustable in a large variety of different contexts without modifying its formal structure, which is every time kind of the same. One aspect making Pentecostal so appealing is that it offers the believers ways to deal with these experiences of social change, with continuity and discontinuity. Another appeal I established during the research is their specific way of worshipping, their unique style and music with its sensational affinity, which gives the believers a special spirituality during the Sunday worship. Against the background of this revival church's flexible adjustment to the respective host context, I showed how in this free metropolis, urban spatial structures had an impact of both on the sacred space as well on the function of those spaces fulfilled for the believers. Ong and Roy, as I discussed earlier, propose worlding as an approach to analyze how urban configurations are both locally specific and embedded in a global processes of networks. This understanding allows us to track the dimensions and forms in which a network of Congolese revival Christians expands globally while adapting differently to urban and national settings. Through transnational agency, Congolese revival Christians are participating locally in the permanent production of a city which is not defined by a circumcised territory unity, but rather as a global connected assemblage of entanglement, religion, political, social practices, spaces, symbols, and materialities. Religion is one of the multiple vehicles here working as an intersection for African migrants and urban actors in the cities worldwide. In the metropolis examined here, one can observe the settlement of religious, social, and entrepreneurial projects that are broadly connected to globally outreaching religious engagement. As a religious urban worlding practice, it transforms and works on inner center centers, as it is in Istanbul, for instance, on peripheral neighborhoods as we see it in Rio de Janeiro, as well as on larger urban systems. Along these lines, religion is a reference point connecting initiatives, styles, interpretations, experiences of the believers and offering the base for resources for a broader scope of options, even under the condition, as we see it in Istanbul, but also in Guangzhou, of discrimination and exclusion. I stop here and would be happy to receive comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heck, for a very enlightening and very interesting talk. I'd like to invite the audience for any questions or comments they might have. If you'd like to pose your question through audiovisual means, just use the raise hand function and we'll call on to you. Or alternatively, you could even type your questions in the chat box below. We still have ample time, roughly 45 minutes or thereabouts. So the floor is open. Rundong Ning, let me.
Okay, thank you, Professor Heck, for this wonderful presentation. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Yale University in anthropology, and I do research on entrepreneurship in Congo Brazzaville. I have a brief question for your study. That is, in those Congolese churches, are those Congolese people more or less grouped by their more specific geographic or ethnic backgrounds? Like, for example, Congo, both Congo Brazzaville and Congo Kinshasa are quite grouped into smaller ethnic groups, and they speak quite different languages. So I was wondering if in those migrants run churches, are those churches more specifically aimed at specific ethnic groups of Congolese people, or more Congolese people in general? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for this question. And actually, this is it's very interesting when you're looking at the landscape, and it's not easy to answer because it's very different. I can only tell from my experience what I encountered. In Rio de Janeiro, for instance, most people have been coming from Congo and from Kinshasa, of course, because, you know, ethnic people from all over Congo, before migrating outside, they very often have already migrated to Kinshasa. So that means they come, the church, for instance, in Rio de Janeiro is predominantly substituted by people who come from the Congo area and from Angola, and who speak Congo, by the way, but also Lingala. Lingala is very often used as the language which is kind of a unifying, because although I know like people are speaking 500 languages in Congo, and there is of course more than only Lingala, it's the predominant language which is used in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In Istanbul, for instance, it was different. In Istanbul, people came also from Lubumbashi, that means from Katanga, but from other regions. And here it was more seen as an African, as a Congolese church. Actually, the pastor wanted to more also incorporate other French-speaking Africans in the church, but predominantly the people I met were coming from all over Congo, I would say. Yes, there are, of course, as you know, ethnic tensions very often, and these are also demonstrated in the churches. So if you have, like, for instance, in a city like Rio de Janeiro, or like Paris, for instance, where you have 500 Congolese churches, I think these ethnic divisions are much more seeable as in a city like Istanbul, where is only one church of them.
Okay. Oh, you're.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I thought you finished your response, so I was about to say thank you.
Yes.
Sorry for my interruption.
Thank you. Would you like to follow up with another question, or?
Yeah, I'm good.
Please. Okay. Well, Dr. Kim, if you would like to pose a question, let me ask to unmute.
Yes, Kim Chen from Hong Kong, been doing research on the religious dimension on the Belt Road Initiative, especially the Chinese going out on the road and to Africa. Just two questions. One question is that, Dr. Heck, and what have you been observing those free churches, or at least that in the diasporic communities, to what extent are they motivated by any religious, for example, mission initiative alongside with the economic and the pastoral work? Namely, are they reaching out to try to convert either the locals or their own kins into the full, especially the charismatic churches? I guess this is my main question. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you for a lot. Yes, I mean, you probably know when you're talking about African revival Christians, there is this kind of remissionarying of Europe. There is this kind of metaphor, this discourse on it. And very often when you are going to in Europe in this kind of churches, you will encounter pastors who are saying we are coming back to bring back Christianity to the secular Europe, for instance. In regions like China and, for instance, Turkey, they are much more aware about the problems they could face if they are going to pro-selectize. So they try to avoid this. Although there is still this narrative, and I mean, when you're looking at, let's say, Nigerian Redeemed Church of God in China, for instance, the Pentecostal Nigerian Church has built there also churches and is kind of pro-selectizing on a surface, I would say. But I didn't do research on that. When I was in Guangzhou, for instance, especially here, people were clearly stating that they are not pro-selectizing anyone. This is again different in Rio de Janeiro. This kind of like we are missioning and we are preaching the gospel is very much part of the religion and the discourse, but that does not really mean that it's really played out in the certain areas. Did I answer this question, Dr. Kin? Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. And there's just a second question, if you don't mind, is do you observe any conflicts of interest of those church leaders? For example, he's a pastor and also, say, a merchant. How would they reconcile this role? Would they ever mention about for example, the business ethic involvement along with there may be conflicts when they are perishing or pastoring their parishioners, if some of them are in business conflicts with them?
I actually did not observe a clear business conflict. I observed throughout the years many conflicts, and very often what happens is that the churches are then separating. There are very often power conflicts, like there's a pastor and there's a young other pastor or a young other pastor coming, and someone is trying to be the head of it. And these kind of conflicts very often are connected to entrepreneurial business, which it's highly delicate to say it's like that or that. But what happens in most cases then is that someone just leaves the church and founds a new church. This is actually happening very often. And then there is a competition. The competition is then very much more on the show, or like the way how you are preaching the gospel on Sunday, who attracts more believers, more congregants as the other.
Interesting. I'd like to now give the opportunity to Dr. Palmer to speak. He has a question.
Okay, hello? Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for coming and sharing this talk, which was absolutely fascinating to see this a truly transcontinental ethnographic presentation touching on Turkey and Brazil and China. And I guess I had two questions. One is, because plus you were also talking about other destinations in France and Brussels and North America. And so are there any, so it seems that there are these churches that get set up in these different places by entrepreneurial pastors. Do they have like, are they completely independent, or are there like some transnational networks or even church organization that covers many of these different countries for the Congolese, for these Congolese communities? So this was my first question about the organizational structure. And the second question, I was curious about, so because you have this case of these migrants from Congo, Kinshasa, and how does this compare with other African migrant communities? So is this typical, or would this be different from like Nigerians or Senegalese or Ivorians? are there different styles for different countries or parts of Africa in terms of how they do things, or is it pretty much, you know, kind of typical? Yeah. So I'm just curious about the comparative dimension.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Palmer. Yes, first question, denominations. There are, of course, denominations also among the awakening churches in Congo-Kinshasa. They are not that huge as the Nigerian church is, the Redeemed Church of God, or the Mountain of Fire in Lagos is much, much bigger and has a much bigger diasporic network. But there's, for instance, the Church of Mama and Papa Olangi, who had been very famous for many years in the Congolese religious diaspora. That means they had like I think in over 50 other countries, they had denominations. But I met some of them in Paris and also in Germany, but then again, you go there and then you have like 5 people who have a prayer group, and this is then called as a denomination. This is very interesting because for these churches, it is highly important to have this kind of diasporic network to say, we are here, but we have hero brand and bearer brand and wearer brand. And also on the other hand, for in the diaspora, for having like let's say like a mother brand or something like a rooted denomination at home is also something which is attracting Congolese to feel this kind of, okay, we are kind of related to home, to pay. In the churches I met, and I really did like a multi-sited ethnography, I just try to follow believers and look, okay, where are they going? What kind of churches are they? And then they have context to all different denominations, but they very often open up their new denomination, their new church. And I think this is very special for this evangelical because you can easily set up, you don't need trained equipment, you don't need to have a training. Mostly they do training later, but you don't need something like having a denomination just to open up a church. You can do it by your own. The second question is not that easy for me to answer, as I did not really do research on other African denominations. I mean, there are similar structures. I mean, when you're looking at Senegal, you have like the Muslim Murids, for instance, who are like expanding very broadly, the diasporic network, which is also kindly close to entrepreneurial endeavors in Italy and in France. And there also the religion is serving as like a meeting point, as a base. When you're then looking at the Pentecostal church communities, there are similarities and there are differences. I think one differentiation is definitely that for instance, what I can say from my research in contrary to the Nigerian Redeemed Church of God, who is really kind of neglecting everything which is kind of African identical, or even like the drum, the music. These churches are mixing everything. They are mixing also like traditional pre-Christian religious instruments and songs in their churches sometimes, but only sometimes. I don't know. Did I answer your question? Or did I forget something?
Yeah.
Dr. Palmer?
Yeah, no, yeah. Right. Yes. Yeah, okay. So I guess just a follow-up on the well, both, I guess it's kind of related to both. So are these, because I noticed in the slide for Istanbul, it emphasized the Francophone church, right?
Yeah.
And so does that mean that these are, so it's primarily based on Congolese, or is, I guess Rundong already asked if it's ethnic, but then my question is it linguistic, so that they would be participants from all Francophone African countries, or is still primarily Congolese, even though they call themselves Francophone, but are they, so I guess I'm still kind of curious about the, how do the Congolese situate themselves within the broader African or Francophone African kind of world?
I mean, actually, the Istanbul slide is very different from the Istanbul church is again different from the ones in Brazil. First of all, the discourse of these churches is that they are like not bound to any ethnicity. They are not bound to any nation. They are very universal. Everyone is invited, and what they really do is, if anyone is coming, if there is someone, a Turkish guy is coming, for instance, then they have someone who is translating for the Turkish. If they had like me, they were translating for me into French. You know, people, these churches are open for everyone, but when you're like looking more closely on it, it is predominantly based on ethnic relations. And in the Istanbul case, for instance, there were Cameroonians who were also joining this church. But I would say it would be like 70% to 30%. Pastor Alain, the head, he was saying that this is for all Francophone people, especially for Africans. And I think this is also tied to his entrepreneurial endeavors, because they are not only translating to Congolese, they are also translating to other people who are coming. So here you can see again the entanglement of entrepreneurial endeavor and the religion.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I may also pose a question, I'm wondering whether in your interaction with a lot of these different communities that are located in various different locales, whether some of them produce very particular eschatological narratives, apocalyptic narratives, because charismatic churches also tend to have that as part of their religious worldview. And I'm wondering also whether there are narratives that take on geopolitical dimensions, because I've seen in terms of, say, I work on, say, Muslim missionary organizations that are embedded in locales where foreign overseas communities have grown significantly, and they're trying to adapt to these communities, like, say, the Chinese presences. And so they've begun to produce also narratives that are very China focused in terms of their missionary endeavor. I mean, you've mentioned that, of course, in response to Dr. Kim, that there isn't much of a missionary impulse, but I'm wondering whether, at least in terms of the eschatological worldview, there are some interesting new developments that you've noted in your ethnographic work.
Yeah. Yes, there are some common narratives that you can encounter all over again. The one is like that the pastor tells you how he became a revival Christian, like there's a dream and there's Satan and there's the evil and the good, and God is speaking to himself, or Jesus is speaking, and you wake up and your mission is this. Very often the foundation of a church is told as a narrative of that in different ways, or very often, like for instance, some of my interlocutors who have become pastors I interviewed had been, before becoming Protestant, involved in the diamond smuggle on the Angolan Congolese frontier. And it has been actually a very dangerous situation at that time. People were like swallowing the diamonds, crossing the border, and then they were going into hospitals because they could not get rid of the diamonds again, so there were like these operations, and there was this rumor that doctors were like doing an operation, the client is dead, and there was no diamond. So in these cases, I had this narrative 3 or 4 times that people were saying, like, and I was really like as diamond smuggler, I was in this kind of really bad, I took alcohol and all this, and then God came and rescued me. So what I wanted to say, it's also a narrative to get out on a safe way out of this diamond business, like it's this kind of narrative you have. So of course you have something like another narrative, which is extremely interesting, especially when we are talking about migration, is that God doesn't know border, the gospel doesn't know border, neither do we. So very often, and I could not show this in my presentation, people are telling me, are drawing because they are undocumented, they are like clandestine, some they're organizing themselves. And the pastor also is reassuring them that God doesn't have borders, so it's allowed for them to be somewhere on a geopolitical level. On another hand, the geopolitical developments in Congo are very often very much part of sermons, but also of discussions. And doing my research in 2013, I think it was the election in Congo, Kinshasa, the re-election of Joseph Kabila, for instance, pastors all over Europe were organizing demonstrations all over Europe and gathering in Paris or in Brussels to demonstrate against Joseph Kabila, who was said to be not, how to say, not really, who was said to be part of Satan's world. Let's say it like that. So on the one hand, on the other hand, there was, of course, there's a division within in this evangelical churches. There were, of course, on the other hand, priestess and pastors who were preaching in favor of Joseph Kabila all over. So you have this kind of conflicts, political conflicts, which are also played out in the sermons, after the sermons, but also in the gospel, in the preaching.
So it's always local politics that dominates.
This is what I it's actually very interesting because it really goes very clear to local politics all the time. Yeah, and this is, I think, the most attractive, appealing thing for the believers, you know, because your daily life is talked in church, you know. So you're going to church and you have a problem and the pastor is telling you something how to deal with it. It's very attractive and very appealing.
Yeah. It's very interesting. There's a question from Jules Liu. Maybe they can pose the question first audio-visually, and then we can also give the floor to Hong Yifeng. Jules, the floor is yours.
Hey, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your speaking. It's fascinating research because I live in Guangzhou over 20 years, but I never know this community. And your research brings me new perspective. And I have two questions. The first one is, and traditional theory believes that when immigrants migrate to a new place, they will bring their own culture and religion there. And there are also some cultural interactions between the migrant and the local people. But according to my perspective, I can't see any cultural interaction between this migrant and the local people. And I can't say that how the local people assimilate local cultural element into their own religion. And I don't know whether you know there are any cultural interactions or religious interactions between these migrants and the local people. And the second question is about the church they established. Because according to my knowledge, I live in Guangzhou for over 20 years, and establishing a church there is very dangerous. I'd like to know their church are legal or illegal, and also the Guangzhou government controls religious people tightly, and how they avoid the local government's control, and how they legitimize their church if without official permission. That's my question. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for all these questions. I hope I can answer some of them. First of all, to the churches, as I said before, they are officially not registered. They are not existent, but they are under surveillance. That means the authorities know about them, but they don't interfere. This is also why I was saying, like, of course, there is not that much interfering on the religious sphere as I observed in my research between the pastors and Chinese people, because we don't want to proselytize. We don't want to be put in danger that they are coming into conflict with authorities. Second, there is interaction. During my research, I was doing interviews with people who have been living for Congolese who have been living for 30 years in Guangzhou, or before in Beijing, and then moved to Guangzhou in the beginning of 2000, who are married with Chinese women very often, where are mostly Congolese men who are married to Chinese women I encountered. So they have children also, they go to school, they live there. Of course, it's kind of precarious status that these Congolese people have, because like, although they are married for 20 years or 30 years to Chinese, they have to renew every year their residence permit, every year from renew. But there are also, as I said, especially on the entrepreneurial levels, there are exchange. I met Chinese who can speak Lingala or Portuguese, because they are like dealing with people who are coming from Kinshasa or coming from Angola on a daily basis for years. And there are restaurants. In these restaurants, of course, Chinese people are working. In Guangzhou, often they came also. There were also migrants who have been coming to Guangzhou. And although there are like 2 or 3 African restaurants, or at that time when I was there was one Bar Mustache. It was opened by Congolese who taught then how to cook Congolese food, and then it was taken over by Chinese. So there are these interconnections. There is also every African community has this kind of committee with the chair of a committee, the president, who are frequently also meeting with authorities in Guangzhou to discuss problems, to discuss certain issues which are happening on a daily basis.
Okay, sorry, maybe I'm not clear. My concept of interaction means religious interaction. Means does, for example, does the Congolese people there, they assimilate religious element from Chinese culture, or they can persuade Chinese people to join in their religion?
As I said, I don't think that this is the situation that they are like persuade Chinese. We are not Chinese to convert, because this would be proselytization. This is by law a very dangerous thing, an endeavor to do that. So I don't know if this happens. Probably this happens. In terms of incorporating Chinese, what you can see in the sermons and in the gospel in the preaching, of course, that pastors are using Chinese words, Chinese expressions, and they are also using Chinese lyrics, for instance, sometimes. But predominantly, as these churches are very much transiting spaces, and as I said, like there are 400 who are based in Guangzhou, but then like 6 or 7 times more are going and coming back. The church itself is not really so much focused on Chinese culture, more on the environment in Guangzhou.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to call in Hong Yifeng. The floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Heck, thank you very much for your presentation. So it seems like these churches are very grassroots, and I'm wondering what influences of nation state have on these churches. Say, for example, do they receive assistance from Congolese embassies in these different destinations? And as you mentioned that they're not officially registered or recognized by the local governments, and they face civilians. And I'm wondering, like, in these different countries, do they face different kind of civilians? Like, for example, like in China, would they reach out by the local governments for management purpose? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I think if you're looking on the Diasporic network, there are different settings for the Congolese churches where they are residing, and I think this case of Guangzhou or Turkey is different from Brazil, where it's not at all a problem to be registered, or also like in the United States or in Europe, Congolese are registering their churches, and they are even receiving state funding sometimes. I know it from France, for instance, or from Germany. For certain endeavors they do, they receive state financing, because it's not a problem on a legal basis. For the Chinese context, we can say, as I said, there are, of course, negotiations with authorities on another level, probably not as a church, but as there is a Congolese community, as I said, a committee which is like a president and certain people who are taking care on the belongings, which is for all African communities. That means you have a Cameroonian committee, you have Congolese committee, you have a Senegalese committee. So these committees are, of course, in negotiations with authorities regarding the community. You know, if someone is caught, for instance, or in the detention center, what can we do? What kind of solutions do we have? If someone passes away, how can we ensure that the corpus is going back to the country, especially when they are undocumented? And all these questions are negotiated with the authorities also, but not as the church, more as being part of this committee. But in the committee, there are, of course, pastors.
Okay, thank you.
Very well. I'm just wondering whether anyone else would like to pose any questions. We still have a 5 to 10 minute leeway remaining. Otherwise, we could conclude this great event already well within the scope of an hour.
Merci beaucoup, de rien. Enchanté.
Thank you, Elf Shukr, for a great conversation and talk. Then very well, I think we can conclude it for today. I'd like to just alert the audience to sort of subscribe to our newsletter, as well as to check out the Bryn Faith website. I believe my colleague Lunar Tong has put in some information related to the project overall. I encourage you to be on the lookout for future events that we will be holding every month with a similar setup and with also extremely interesting scholars. And again, I'd like to reiterate the thanks of the community here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences to you, Dr. Gerda Heck, for a wonderful talk. And hopefully we will be able to bring you to Hong Kong in person at some point.
Yes, and sometimes, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Inshallah. And thank you for the audience as well for coming.